in 2011 at Camp Bastion in Afghanistan. I watched a company of Royal Marines commandos heading deep into hostile territory. Their mission was to set up a new patrol base as a lure to attract the enemy to them. They're going in effectively as human bait, and they're going to invite attack.
At 1-2 Delta, get your Bergens on the flatbed and load onto that first coat. Do that.
This is a very, very risky mission indeed. The place is reportedly crawling with insurgents.
Right, fellas, start getting in your order of march.
Now 100 Royal Marines are heading out tonight. And of course everybody's praying that 100 Royal Marines will eventually return. I had my fears, but as I watched those men depart, I could never have imagined the fate that awaited them. Of these Marines, 3 were to die, 20 were to be seriously injured, and one, eventually to be known to everybody as Marine A, was to commit a battlefield crime so serious that it was to send shockwaves around the world.
A Royal Marine is found guilty of murdering an Afghan insurgent in cold blood. Evidence from a helmet camera showed how the injured Afghan was shot in the chest. Senior commanders condemn what happened.
It was a truly shocking and appalling aberration. It should not have happened, and it should never happen again.
In my letters I write to him, I always put, I'm very proud of you, son. You haven't disgraced yourself. You haven't disgraced us.
He's murdered somebody, and murder is murder.
Murder is murder. It never really applies because all murders are different.
Who's to say in the kind of ebb and flow of a firefight, when all these things are going on around you, who among us might not do the same thing?
Marine A is the first British serviceman to be convicted of murder on active service since the Second World War. But was the killing a tactical decision? Was it a mercy killing? Or was it a battlefield execution prompted by revenge and hatred? The act of a man traumatized by war.
Deliver ray of fire now, lad.
When I first heard that it was a Royal Marine who had been arrested for the cold-blooded murder of a badly injured Taliban insurgent, I have to admit I was shocked to the core. As a filmmaker, I've been privileged to train with the Royal Marines, live with them, and go to war with them on many occasions in Afghanistan.
Get down into cover. Move around. Quickly get down low. Just get down to that low.
We're under heavy attack. Taliban are fighting back hard. Now these men normally espouse a strong ethos of ferocity in battle, but magnanimity in victory. And alongside them I've experienced the mind-bending terror and thrill of combat. I've known Marines who've been killed in action, and I've known many who've suffered horrific, life-changing injuries. So, cards on the table. I don't come to this story as a dispassionate observer. I come as a passionate one. It's not just that I want to know what happened on that fateful day. I need to know. Marine A was eventually revealed as a 5-tour veteran who'd seen action in Northern Ireland, Iraq and Afghanistan. By all accounts, a fine soldier with an unblemished record, and who'd been marked for promotion. He was 39-year-old Sergeant Alexander Blackman. So what sort of man is he?
He's amazing. Never met anybody like him. He's just so gentle and calm and generous, and yes, he's a big softie.
Is your husband a murderer?
Absolutely not. No way, no shape, no form. Just categorically no.
Even though he's convicted as one?
I don't know that I know what defines somebody as a murderer, but everything that defines Al points me and everybody else in completely the opposite direction.
I'll love him no matter what, and I know he's had to make difficult different choices and things that I wouldn't want to have to make personally, but it's war. It's not the black and white wars that we want them to be. It's every shade of grey in between.
I'm not ashamed of him because he was doing his job, he was doing his duty to the country and everybody in this country and the Queen. And that's what he was sent out to do, to get rid of the insurgents.
The trouble is that we're trying very hard to rationalise something that happened in a war zone, in a different country, on the other side of the world, in circumstances that none of us will ever begin to understand.
It's true. Nobody could imagine real war. You have to be there. Well, back in 2011, I was, and I discovered that by complete coincidence, it was Sergeant Blackman's company I had filmed heading out from Camp Bastion to enemy territory. Less than 2 weeks later, after they'd come under sustained and heavy attack and taken many casualties, they were relieved temporarily by another company of Royal Marines, a company that I was embedded in. So I flew into exactly the same place that Sergeant Blackman had been serving in, and was to serve in again, and where a few months on, he was to shoot that insurgent. This beleaguered British outpost, called Toki, was nothing short of a death trap set in the middle of what was described to me then as the most dangerous square mile in the world.
The main threat will be IEDs. Actions on contact IED. Get an IED, okay, with goal firm, self-treat yourself if you've got any arms and legs left. Okay, I'll call in the helo, so it should be at Bastion, I don't know, within 21 minutes or whatever, okay?
My time at this place was to give me an intimate insight into a brutally unforgiving way of life.
They think that they'll only have a go at us if they think that we are vulnerable or they'll get away with it. And that's what it's all about, engaging them on our terms when they think they're okay. The key thing is to try and kill them. If we get the chance, that's a priority.
The men's job was to seek out the Taliban who'd been intimidating the local villagers and farmers for years. The Marines were there primarily to protect the local Afghan people. Everybody keeping a sharp lookout for anybody watching us, basically, and there's bound to be. We can't see them at the moment, but they'll be monitoring our movements all the way. If we repeat our routes, it's easy to catch us out and lay those killer traps. So every footstep is taken very gingerly, believe me. And all this in scorching heat. It's about 50 degrees today. It was more like 100 degrees. By the time I got to Turkey, 4 men had been killed and many more injured, all through booby traps and mines.
The best word to describe them is fucking cowards. They realise they can't stand and fight us, they're just resorting to dirty tactics, you know, and prove how cowardice they are. I mean, they get children to do their dirty work for them, you know, send them out to watch us and then reporting to us, and women, you know, if they want to flip and take us on, take us on. Don't be fucking pussies about it. You know, I fucking hate them, all of them.
Well, was Sergeant Blackman a Marine who couldn't contain that sort of emotion? Whilst he could still be ferocious in battle, had he lost that famous Royal Marine ability to be magnanimous in victory? Had he simply lost the plot? The incident was captured on a fellow Marine's head camera. For legal reasons I can't show you the moving footage, but I can play you still frames and let you hear some of the audio. It all started with an Apache helicopter attack that left a Taliban insurgent severely injured. What followed in these cornfields spanned at least 40 minutes.
You fucking bastard. You promised, fella. You're fuck about you, son.
Sergeant Blackman and his men dragged the insurgent across a field and discussed what to do with him.
Anybody want to do first aid on this idiot? Nope. Nope.
They'd already found and removed a live grenade and a weapon hidden in the insurgents' clothes. Next comes an indication that despite initial reluctance, they at least go through the motions of patching the insurgent up.
We'll patch him with FFD. That'll do, Mona.
And then some sporadic talk about calling in a helicopter to evacuate the insurgent as a battlefield casualty.
Better turn up a 9-9 first.
Yeah, we're just waiting to get out of our line and maybe go with it.
And there, a radio message to suggest that the insurgent was dead. Then, a few minutes later, a gunshot. Sergeant Blackman discharging his weapon into the insurgent's chest. If he was not dead, he is now.
Yeah, shuffle off his mortal coil, you cunt. Nothing you would do to us.
I know.
Exactly. Alright. Obviously this doesn't go anywhere, fellas.
Yeah, roger, mate.
I've just broken the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, roger.
Deed done. But, as far as his court-martial was concerned, this was not the desecration of a corpse, but a cold-blooded battlefield execution, recorded on one of these, although Sergeant Blackman didn't know it at the time. So, Blackman, caught red-handed, guilty as charged, banged to rights. But his conviction of murder, a life sentence of 10 years without parole, and dismissed with disgrace from the Royal Marines, has, at a stroke, provoked strong public reaction and divided opinion. This is the day of sentencing for the killers of Lee Rigby, the British soldier brutally murdered by Muslim extremists on a South London street. The killing horrified the nation, and many here now are ex-servicemen who've come to express their outrage.
You can see that all around me now. There's a lot of passion. A lot of people around here have got very distinct views, very real views, very strong views about the justice that is involved in this. And of course they've got equally strong opinions about Marine A and his conviction.
He was in a theatre of war and it shouldn't even have gone as far as court. Simple as that.
The whole justice system in this country is literally been flipped upside down. We're sending our soldiers to jail for life for doing their job, but we're allowing paedophiles and murderers to roam the streets. I think it's an absolute disgrace.
Our soldiers have seen the mates being strung up and hung up in trees, chopped to bits. That's got to have an effect on somebody, and that, it doesn't deserve a sentence.
How can it possibly be murder? You're sent to a war zone to kill. He's a Marine, his job is to kill. And his job was to kill terrorists.
Ladies and gentlemen, on the 10th of April in this very building there's going to be an appeal by Marine A, Sergeant Blackman. So if everyone's willing, we're going to be back here on the April 10th to show our solidarity for a true British hero who's risked his life for this country. All right?
Perhaps not surprisingly, here there is nigh on universal support for Sergeant Blackman. But this is just one poll of opinion. And let's not forget, the background to his conviction is, as he admitted, the breaking of the Geneva Convention.
It is only for the protection of prisoners, the sick and wounded, and the non-combatant civilians that Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions applies. International law prohibits the following: murder, torture, cruel treatment of prisoners or taking hostages, humiliating or degrading treatment of prisoners, illegal sentencing and execution of prisoners without a fair trial by a regularly constituted court.
The Geneva Convention has actually been around since 1864, and most recently revised in 1949.
There was a massive revulsion post-Second World War to what had happened. That's why you need rules, because if the human being is left to their own devices, they do bad things.
So your view of Alexander Blackman?
My view is he's let himself down, he's let his family down, he's let his regiment down, he's let his country down. He's murdered somebody. And murder is murder, whether it's on the streets of London or in Afghanistan. And people who confuse the debate with fog of war type arguments, you know, he's on active duty, he somehow deserves some extra element of discretion. That's nonsense. It was a murder. He was found guilty of murder. He deserves the sentence he received, in my view.
Clearly everyone has an opinion about Marine A, Sergeant Blackman. Some condemning him, some condoning him. But the ethical and moral issues his case throws up are profound.
Marine Ace should be serving a prison sentence. He committed an atrocity, he knew it was an atrocity, he laughed about the Geneva Conventions. So yes, it is completely appropriate that he's punished for that. You know, war is not a free-for-all. We train our soldiers to not only to kill people but also to not kill people, to know where that line is, and we can't simply have people breaking the laws of war. We have seen in previous conflicts, the Vietnam War being the most obvious one, where there was huge complicity with the committing of atrocities, and once you start doing that, it very, very rapidly escalates and becomes an even more serious issue. So yes, it is completely right that he was convicted and that he is being punished for it.
It's not a straightforward situation. There are two different moral imperatives. One is that you shouldn't kill, and the other is that if you put people in extreme situations and ask them to act on your behalf, you can't be as judgmental as you would be about a case of an ordinary murder in the street. The thing that keeps soldiers fighting isn't love of democracy or Queen and country or the things that people say. It's loyalty to the little troop of people around them that they've trained with. And they will put their lives on the line for the other people in that group in the way that they know that the others will do for them. And that sense of loyalty, that sense of solidarity, it's summed up in the phrase a sacred band of brothers. And the word sacred is not incidental there. It goes to something really deep in the human psyche. So that kind of loyalty will make you rush out and draw fire so that your colleagues can escape to safety, but it will also make you feel you need revenge for the wrongs that have been done to your colleagues.
Dave Devenny was a Royal Marines commander who fought in the Falklands War. On leaving the forces, he was ordained in the Church of Scotland. He then returned to the Royal Marines as the chaplain. He has special insight into battlefield behaviour.
It's very difficult for many, many young men and women who are in conflict in Afghanistan to try and get inside the minds of the people who are actually trying to kill them. So they're kind of one step emotionally removed from the people they're called to go out and engage. They can't relate to them. They find it very difficult. They see them often as completely barbaric, and sometimes, you know, when things happen in the battlefield, they are. I mean, you know, there's been instances of, you know, soldiers who have been captured, who have been killed, skinned alive, dismembered, and their body parts left out to warn off the other members of patrols. So that's quite a tough situation to find yourself in, and I can understand sometimes when you get young men and women in that situation that there's almost a sense of a temptation at least to feel that, hang on a second, you know, all the bets are off here. You know, we're playing to a certain set of rules and criteria, but these guys aren't. You know, and they would kill us like dogs as soon as they catch us. You know.
I was always told in Afghanistan, never let yourself be captured by the Taliban. Sooner put a bullet in your own head than let that happen. I never had to face that choice, thank God. But I'll never forget the emotional pressure of going out on patrol. Never knowing if the enemy would be hiding in the cornfields waiting to attack, or if your next footstep was going to detonate a mine, an IED. Rob Driscoll, an ex-Royal Marine sergeant, was mentioned in dispatches for conspicuous gallantry in Afghanistan. He served alongside Sergeant Blackman in the hellhole that was Toki.
I think we knew that where we were going, we were the bait and we were going into the lion's den, and we kind of were lured into killing areas, and it really was just a series of ambushes on each patrol that left the safe base.
Go! Yeah, safe!
Unfortunately, we were outgunned on several occasions, so it was pretty hairy because we had to wait to be shot at.
Ah, that's right. You couldn't shoot until you were shot at.
No. If we'd have to positively ID a threat, and then that threat would then have to become a threat to us. So in theory, we could positively ID a Taliban fighter with a weapon, but until he's pointed that weapon at us, under those rules of engagement, we weren't able to return fire or protect ourselves.
I recall this myself. Everyone was always on full alert when on patrol, knowing that ambush was likely. It was chilling, and doubly chilling when you had to wait for the enemy to make the first move. But those were the rules, and they were set in stone.
British troops in Afghanistan are not allowed to fight until the Taliban attack them, and that puts them under psychological pressure. It's almost like fighting with one arm tied behind your back. If the soldier feels that he's not being treated fairly by the rules of engagement, that the dice is loaded against him, that can build up a sort of resentment and a feeling that this very dangerous task is being made more difficult than it should be. And you can see that that will lead to frustration, feeling of impotence, and a lowering of morale.
How are you coping with the pressure?
I'm not sure if coping was the right kind of answer. I think as a commander, people were looking up to me, and I had to almost project an unnerved appearance. But I was as worried as the young Marines were. In fact, probably more so, because I'd experienced what the Taliban were capable of in previous tours. So I think the way we coped was a black humour, which is typical of the Royal Marines, and from an outsider's perspective, it could almost look as if there's an element of enjoyment, and that is a survival kind of technique that you adopt in those situations.
Hostile, threatening environments can lead to a view of the world and those close to you that is beyond normal experience. Gwen Adshead is a specialist in the psychology of murder.
This has almost more in common with gang violence in a way than it does with, sort of type of regular homicide. The young men in gangs, I think often talk this way about taking out members of opposite gangs, and certainly have a pride and a satisfaction in taking out other guys, and would have no question of holding back, and the rules don't apply. Knowing that it may be wrong in the eyes of others, but from their own perspective, in terms of the code of the gang warfare, as it were, there's a type of honour to it. Of course, in theory, armies fighting other armies are not like gangs, but that I guess that many people would say is that those classical rules of war, the notion of two armies meeting and playing by the rules, has gone out the window a long time ago.
Rob, the day Sergeant Blackman shot the insurgent, do you recall the circumstances?
Well, I remember the day very well. We'd been out on patrol. We'd actually been engaged on that patrol, and we'd had to essentially withdraw from the area, and we were unable to complete our task because it would have meant going forward into an area where we knew that there were a lot of Taliban. So I was in the checkpoint when events unfolded, and I was relieved when ultimately the Taliban insurgent died. It did mean that we wouldn't have to mobilise a medical evacuation helicopter. Tactically, they would have done anything to incur more injuries on ISAF troops. If they could shoot a helicopter down, well then, we would have handed them the trophy.
The insurgent that Sergeant Blackman shot had already been shot by an Apache helicopter, so he would have been pretty badly hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I saw quite a few people that had been or sustained injuries from the Apache helicopters, and although I'm not a medical professional, I would say, again, very few of them would survive their injuries.
So, Rob, what would you have done?
In my professional view, I wouldn't have approached a injured Taliban fighter. I would have eliminated that threat from a distance. So I think, if I'm really, really honest, I probably would have done the same.
In that kind of situation, when you see friends being killed, or even when you look down on enemy deads, you always think that could be me. It's human nature. You look, I mean, I remember looking at dead Argentines on Mount Harriet and thinking, my gosh, that's someone's husband or son or whatever, and that could easily have been me tonight. So you take that away with you, and I look back on it and think, well, you know, I did exactly what I had to do as a professional young Royal Marine commando, but also I grew up, if you like, in the midst of that conflict.
But let me ask you, Dave, I know you're a chaplain, but can you say hand on heart that you might not have done exactly the same as Blackman?
No, I couldn't say hand on heart that I wouldn't have done the same thing. I think in that situation, and I have to say that I don't know all the details, but hypothetically, if we'd in a firefight, there was a potentially mortally wounded Afghan fighter lying there, I would have patrolled towards him, you know, and probably from a distance, safe distance, fired some shots into him, because these guys will quite happily often just die, pull a grenade when you're or be lying on a grenade, you turn them over, you get hit, or as you approach, pull a grenade, and you've lost the guys in your section. And I think as a senior NCO tasked with the care of my team, then I would in all probability, for the safety of my guys, would have shot into his body till I was convinced the guy was no longer a threat.
I'm not a combatant, of course. I shoot with a camera, not a gun. But after spending time in Toki, always under threat of attack and the fear of capture, even I found my mind was bending, hardening to the kill or be killed environment.
We had been dehumanised so much because of the barbaric nature of the Taliban. I mean, these guys weren't there that would shoot you and then, you know, give you a noble burial. They would hang you up in a tree and crucify you and cut off your testicles, put them in your mouth. That's the nature of the people we were dealing with. You know, how do you deal with an enemy like that? You know, they saw our kind of laws and our kind of behaviour as weakness. Do we walk around being the weak security force, or do we have to project an air of Taliban masculinity? It's a huge adaptation that every single Marine or every single combat soldier that has dealt with the Taliban will have had to go through. And I think, you know, we had to almost equalise their brutality within the laws imposed on us, which is very hard.
The Taliban have no rules at all, and sometimes their behaviour is quite appalling to our mind. Indeed, there's no moral equivalence, I believe, between one of our soldiers, a Marine or soldier, who's joined up to protect his nation, has gone through proper training, has been taught how to behave and things, and a terrorist who actually their stated aim actually is to kill innocent civilians because they want to draw attention to their cause. So there's no moral equivalence there.
The kind of pressures that are on these men when they're in that situation are very, very hard to imagine for those who haven't been in that kind of situation. And when they get to grips with the enemy, when they come face to face with the enemy, an enemy, let's not forget, that has absolutely no scruples, that does not play fair, does not play by the rules, that is quite happy to cut people up, torture them, hang their limbs up from trees, that then when our soldiers are faced with these people who have killed their own men, then yes, you can hope that they will not behave in the kind of way that Sergeant Blackman did. You can train them not to, but you can't guarantee they won't. It's the nature of conflict, it's the nature of war.
In the early days of the Afghan conflict, when it was, relatively speaking, a conventional shooting war, there was, I would say, a begrudging respect for the Taliban as fierce but courageous warriors. But in later years, when the Taliban started resorting to brutal guerrilla tactics, they were increasingly demonized.
Most of the young men and women who are out there on the battlefield in Afghanistan do not understand that culture. And in some respects see these guys who are these insurgents, these Taliban fighters, as something less than human, especially when they see their friends, their mates, their oppos being brutally killed and barbarously dealt with even after death.
No matter what the British Army or the British government or the British population thinks of the Taliban and the various factions fighting within the Taliban do not see themselves as murdering terrorists. That's not how they see themselves. How they see themselves, they have all kinds of rationales for what they're doing. But the overall justification for the kind of methods they use is they are the weaker side. They are the weaker side, therefore they're obliged to use whatever methods can get them results.
The thing is, once one side starts breaking the rules, there's always a danger that the other side will too. This has happened throughout the history of warfare, and is always accelerated if there's an obvious cultural disconnect between foes.
The Afghan people are perceived as being extremely so different from your sort of British soldier, and the culture is so different that it makes it very easy to sort of assume, well, maybe they don't really feel as much, maybe they all are actually terrorists, you know, their lives aren't worth as much as the British lives. So you treat the enemy as though they are lesser human, or maybe not even human at all, they're just animals to be hunted, they're fair game. It's an attempt to ignore the fact that, of course, the person that you are killing, the person you are mutilating, is flesh and blood like you, has a wife, has children the same age as your children, has an aged grandmother or whatever. So dehumanizing them tries to alleviate that guilt.
Yes, Japanese is very funny people. You might not call them human beings, they're more like animals. The better estimation of them is more like field rats.
Dehumanization is so much easier to do if the enemy is of a different culture, different religion, different ethnicity. And we saw this, of course, during the Second World War very strongly, that the Second World War, British and American soldiers were much more atrocity prone in the war in the Pacific than they were in Europe, for example.
That war was a war where the Japanese culture was so alien to these young guys coming out of America. They couldn't see the humans, really, basically human beings. And especially because there was many instances where the Japanese themselves were quite barbaric towards the US Marine Corps and the soldiers on the ground. And so it seems that war became, everything was ranked up a ratchet or two, and it wasn't a case of just bringing these guys to the negotiating table. They were just quite content to annihilate them.
There are lots of examples of prisoners of war being killed after they've surrendered in both world wars. Ian Fraser, an officer in the Scots Guards, wrote home to his mother in May 1945 to say to her, "Don't imagine that when German troops who've been trying to kill us put their hands up and say, 'We surrender,' that we accept their apology. And we make a point of dispatching them quickly, because these are the conventions of war. They would do exactly the same to us. And it's unfair of civilians to expect us to behave in a different way." He says to his mother, "You probably won't understand this, but my father, I think, will, because he fought at Gallipoli and he has direct experience of combat with the Turks, and he will understand that the rules of war are so different to what we as civilized civilians are willing to accept."
The reality is, once you get involved in heavy fighting, things change.
A city is literally being wiped out before your eyes. Explosions and fires are sucking the oxygen from the air. Nothing can live in this inferno.
Who would have thought in 1939 that we would firebomb major cities with the aim of immolating children, women, all of these things? It would have been inconceivable. But as you fight, things change. That's what's so horrible about war. That's why it's much better if you don't end up in wars. And yes, you need rules, and there are rules, and it's quite clear if you've broken them. And there's no doubt that this Marine did break the rules. But I think you have to take all those other factors into account.
Yeah, shut off his mortal coil, you cunt. Nothing you would do to us.
I know.
Exactly.
It all came across as very callous. I mean, a lot of people have been shocked by the foul-mouthed language, the Shakespearean quote and the laughing. I mean, it did come over as pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I agree what he said. It did sound very dramatic, and I think there is an air of drama that comes with command. And I think what we witnessed there was a bit of bravado. That man had adrenaline coursing flowing through his veins, you know. He knows that after that threat, he's still got a 600 or 700 metre walk back to his CP, which when me and you sit here and talk about walking 600 or 700 metres, it seems nothing. 600 or 700 metres in Afghanistan is 600 or 700 potential IED steps. This was all running through his mind.
I think you can deconstruct Blackman's words quite carefully. You've got this Shakespearean quote, you've got the expletive, and then you've got this notion, this isn't anything that you wouldn't do to us. So in that, there's a kind of high emotion, the poetry, quoting Shakespeare, shuffle off this mortal coil, and then this very base word which changes the tone of it entirely. And then a kind of moral justification, I'm not doing anything you wouldn't do, so therefore it's all right. So within that little few words, you see some of this confusion and these moral clashes and these cultural clashes, the emotion versus the reason, the self-justification, and the vehemence in the expletive. In those few little words, you see the entire confusion of the situation captured.
But was it a moral confusion spurred by hate and a hunger for revenge, or a mental confusion brought on by exhaustion and emotional distress?
You can't train anyone to be relentlessly attacked. And if we were to put it into kind of a civilian context, you know, relentlessly punched in the face and do nothing, which we did do for a long time. So I think, did that one punch on the nose flick something that reacted another punch back? It's as simple as that. Did he flick into a primeval sense? I'm not a psychologist, I can only talk from my experiences, but I know there were moments out there where I did see the red mist. I lost the plot. You know, I know that there were moments out there where I was not fully sane.
It's been described as a moment of madness, and I think that describes it perfectly. He can't undo it. I'm sure he'd love to meet Doctor Who, travel back in time and undo that moment. I don't doubt it for a second. I'm still not sure that we quite should have led us to where we are now. But yeah, if we could, absolutely. In a millisecond.
If you had to put a label on it, why not call it a moment of madness? Because I think that's probably that's the most digestible phrase. I think if you look into depth what a moment of madness is, then maybe you can see what was happening with Al. We're only human, and we actually only undergo a year's worth of training. It's an incredibly efficient year's worth of training, but they haven't removed our brain and inserted a computer which completely obeys orders. We're as professional as we can be. I think my point is, how do you train for that moment? How do you install this moral compass? And as much as that moral compass wants to do the right thing, sometimes you're overcome by other emotions and there are other bigger considerations.
When I heard the footage, I wasn't actually shocked. You know, these things are happening all the time. In any war, they're happening, other people are doing it. The difference here is that Marine A got caught. He got caught on camera. It's right that he's punished for that, but I don't think we should fool ourselves that this is an isolated case. It's happening all the time.
The National. Here is Brian Stewart.
Good evening. A Canadian soldier is facing a charge of second-degree murder tonight. Captain Robert Semrau is accused of killing a presumed insurgent in Afghanistan, a man allegedly unarmed at the time.
On October 18th, Captain Robert Semrau gave this interview to a U.S. Army journalist about an upcoming operation in Helmand Province.
We'll do some aggressive patrolling, some defensive work, and try and root out the Taliban and kill and capture them.
A short time later, he was allegedly involved in an incident there that turned him from a mentor into an accused murderer.
It's uncanny how many similarities there are between Rob Semrau's case and Alexander Blackman's. Both NATO soldiers who shoot a Taliban insurgent allegedly dead or dying after an attack by an Apache helicopter. A key difference is that Semrau, with some witnesses claiming this to have been a mercy killing, was ultimately found not guilty of murder. He was dismissed from service, however, and is now living free in Ottawa, though still imprisoned by his memories.
You couldn't pay me enough to go back to that place. No desire to ever go back. It's, you know, it's literally the dark side of the moon with mines. The enemy is very clever. They want you dead. They hate you more than they hate anything in the whole world. They will kill anybody, women and children, anyone to get to you. Everyone's expendable as long as they kill you. Nobody is the same person as he was going into that terrible place.
On the day in question, Semrau and his unit, after heavy fighting, came across a scene of utter devastation following an Apache airstrike.
If you haven't seen what an Apache gunship can do to a human being, you haven't seen anything. It's as though the hand of God comes down from the sky and just rips people apart. And we came across grievously wounded Taliban. I looked up in the trees and saw what looked like sausage links dangling from the trees, and my brain said, cannot compute, cannot compute. I didn't understand what sausage links would be doing in the trees until I realized it was human intestines. The Apache gunship had shot this Taliban, I guess, out of the tree and ripped him apart. His foot was severed, his leg was severed and up over his shoulders with just a piece of muscle connecting it. Somebody said there was like a dinner plate sized chunk ripped out of his midsection, almost like a shark bite. Some said he was alive, some said he was dead.
But then you were accused of his murder.
What I was later accused of was second-degree murder, in that the prosecution believed he was still alive, and I shot him with the intention of killing him. Witnesses attributed to me the words that I couldn't live with myself if I left a fellow human being in this condition. But how do you treat somebody like that? I've realized a few things, and it's that war many times leaves you with a choice between bad and worse. There is no good choice. There is no good option. And in many situations, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. The way the charges were set up against me, if I acted humanely and compassionately and I ended this Taliban's life, I'm a murderer, according to Canadian law, and I'm damned. If we decide to leave him, then I'm damned in that situation because I failed to perform a military duty, in that I didn't stay put and try and do something. So I'm in trouble either way. If we stayed and tried to retreat him, then in all likelihood we're going to be surrounded, much as I imagine in Blackman's case. The enemy is there. We've managed to chase him away, but he is recouping and he can come after us again. Then me and my team are surrounded and killed, and we're lucky to only be killed. So any way you look at the situation, you lose.
Semrau was acquitted of murder, but convicted of disgraceful conduct for shooting an unarmed, severely injured Taliban fighter, and dismissed from the Canadian Army. Alexander Blackman also dismissed from service, was convicted of murder and sentenced to 10 years without parole. The court-martial did not accept his story that he thought the insurgent was dead.
When he was young, little, if he was telling a fib, his ears would go red, and it would slowly go red down his neck and across his face. His brother could lie for England, but he couldn't. So I said to the officer, when Alexander said he didn't kill, he shot him, but he'd already died, did his ears go red? And he said no. So I said, in that case, he was telling the truth. He said, what do you mean? I said, he can't tell a lie. His ears go red.
It's not surprising that Alexander Blackman's family are resolutely fighting his corner.
Had a letter of support sent to the Prime Minister, so I've just mentioned that.
But for the rest of us, the question of what he did and the punishment he deserves is far more complicated.
I think it's so important that we actually maintain a very firm line. But when that line is transgressed from time to time, then I think we need to have a much more nuanced, sensitive and textured approach to the individual and the circumstances they've undergone to put them into that position where someone who could, in every other respect, in every other compartment and corner of their lives, is a moral person, a family person, a disciplined, highly valued member of an elite team, and suddenly something changes. And just to say murderer in this very ambiguous age of conflict and warfare that we live in nowadays, I think we need to take a much, much more sensitive approach to these individuals because we demand so much of them.
We have to share the responsibility as a society. Politicians who make the decisions have to share the responsibility, but they don't end up in court like Blackman. A man who's sitting at a computer in America sending drone bombs into Pakistan, killing more people than Blackman did, he's not in court. Politicians aren't in court. We're not in court. Blackman is in court. It's hard not to feel that he's a scapegoat.
Assuming that it's correct that the Taliban commit atrocities, isn't that the strongest reason as to why we should not go down to that level? Isn't that a compelling argument that we are a strong democracy, we observe the rule of law, we're much more likely to win the battle for hearts and minds if we stand firm and observe the basic principles of the laws of war and human rights law?
If you can imagine, if we had a self-cam on every soldier during the Second World War or the First World War, we would have tens of thousands of cases. Tens of thousands. Now that doesn't mean it's right, but I think we have to be realistic and pragmatic about it.
Tomorrow, the 10th of April, is Alexander Blackman's appeal in the High Court, where the Lord Chief Justice will preside. But everyone seems to have a view. Some judge Alexander Blackman. Some refuse to judge him. Some revile him, some revere him. There are extremes of opinion, and many shades of opinion in between. Of course, one person I can't talk to in this tragic story is the insurgent himself. A ruthless enemy he might have been, but he was also someone's son, someone's brother, and maybe someone's father, who knows? So let me leave you with this question. Given what you now know, given what you've seen, given what you've heard, imagine yourself in Helmand. Imagine yourself faced with that injured insurgent after bloody battle. Imagine yourself a Royal Marine sergeant. And ask yourself this question. What would I do?
Tomorrow at 9 on BBC One, the Panorama special, Don't Cap My Benefits.
state-of-the-art tank, armed, steel-clad, and on the move. The pinnacle of mobility of a 4,000-year race to bring speed, protection, and firepower to the battlefield. The quest for mobility has produced many shockwaves, from the ancient chariot to heavily armed cavalry to the mighty battle tank. Each step forward has caused advantage to shift and armies to adapt.
This is the age of the knight. He is virtually invincible.
Always it has been the hunt for the perfect formula of armor, agility, and weapons. The results have been creative and intimidating.
Nothing you shoot at them will stop them, and in your mind it's you they're coming for.
And when they come with force.
It's the Holocaust on a tank battlefield.
The ultimate goal, the creation of the perfect armed fighting machine. In ground warfare, mobile units are at the heart of the fighting force. What they bring to the battlefield is the ability to project power over distance and cover ground faster than infantry. Today, the American Abrams M1A2 tank reigns supreme. It is one of the largest, most complex ground war machines ever built. Crushing firepower and formidable armor put it at the apex of tank evolution.
There are three primary factors that influence tank design. They are how big is the gun, how well protected are they, and how mobile are they?
The way these questions are answered depends on the goal of the designer. The Abrams' big gun and thick armor come at a price to its speed and maneuverability. These trade-offs, so integral to the decision-making process today, have been influencing weapons builders for millennia, all the way back to the age of the chariot. In 1457 BC, Megiddo, in the Middle East. Two great armies clashed in one of history's earliest recorded chariot battles. Egyptian mobile forces led by Pharaoh Thutmose III attacked a coalition of Canaanite rebels. With speed and ferocity, they won the battle and captured close to 1,000 enemy chariots. The Egyptian chariots were cutting edge for their time, an improvement on earlier designs from other civilizations. They exhibited an effective blend of features: a horse for propulsion, 6-spoked wheels for strength and speed, and a bow for firepower. Earlier pre-Egyptian chariots had been heavier and more cumbersome, like the Sumerian battle wagon with 4 solid disc wheels. But the Egyptian archers wanted a more nimble fighting machine, a stable but maneuverable platform from which they could aim and shoot.
The Egyptian chariot was a fighting vehicle, and as in all fighting vehicles, you want to make them ride smoothly so you have accuracy when firing your missiles. One of the ways the Egyptians achieved a smooth riding firing platform was through the design and construction of the wheels. These included eventually 6 spokes, rims wrapped in shrunken hide, which formed a tire, as well the fighting deck that the warrior and the driver stood on had a springy feel that absorbed a lot of the shock.
Many of the Egyptian design features can still be seen on today's chariots, or at least their modern-day racing equivalents. These harness racing carts, known as sulkies, are built for speed and mobility. Though it looks simple, the sulky is expertly designed. Every detail of the cart is carefully constructed to maximize speed around the racetrack. It weighs as little as 58 pounds, and its frame tube is elliptically shaped, like an airplane wing, to minimize drag. Low weight is essential for speed, and remarkably, the Egyptian chariot was not much heavier than the modern sulky. It weighed about 80 pounds. The Egyptians sacrificed armor to keep the weight down. But that meant the two-man crew, driver and archer, were left unprotected.
That's not because they didn't want to protect the individual inside. It's because they felt they didn't need to. Because any chariot was supposed to fight away from the army. They were supposed to be able to pour archery fire on somewhere from a distance.
That way they could be effective, but stay out of harm's way. The Egyptians fine-tuned their vehicle to meet the desired specs. They set the axle at the very rear of the platform, maximizing the chariot's ability to quickly change direction during battle.
These chariots had to be able to turn on a dime, stop on a dime, where other chariots are turning, spinning, and wheeling.
But the rapid changes in direction increased the likelihood of a flip. To reduce that risk, Egyptian engineers widened the wheelbase. With almost 6 feet between the two wheels, the chariot could take tight turns and still remain upright. The design worked well for the Egyptians. It gave them an effective weapon for the style of fighting they preferred and the terrain on which they fought. But not all armies opted for fast and maneuverable. As battle tactics evolved, other commanders found new uses for chariots in war. This titanic machine rolled across the Middle East in the 7th century BC. It belonged to the Assyrians and carried 4 heavily armed and armored warriors. It was built to plow through light infantry.
It was meant to ride directly into the infantry force, to make the driver, to make the riders all part of a military unit to attack.
The chariot proved its worth for thousands of years, but it did have limitations. It failed on rough or swampy ground, and it was expensive to build and maintain. By Roman times, it had been relegated to ceremonial use and racing. Ironically, the chariot was ultimately usurped by one of its own key components.
What kills off the chariot is the horse. Now that seems very strange, but horseback riding will eventually mean that the chariot is no longer needed on the battlefield.
Selective breeding turned the lightweight draft animal into a powerful beast that could carry a man into battle. Saddles soon followed, but it would take hundreds of years before another innovation in China would transform the horse into a true weapon of war. It was the solid stirrup, and it fused horse and rider into a single fighting unit. Over the next centuries, it slowly made its way across Asia to the battlefields of Europe. There it turned heavily armed cavalrymen into dominant medieval fighters. In 1429, Patay, in northern France. A crucial battle in the vicious 100 Years' War between the English and the French. At Patay, the English infantry was unprepared for an attack of 1,500 heavily armed French horsemen. The cavalry swept through the English lines. It was a swift and total defeat. The foot soldiers were overwhelmed by the riders and their steeds.
This is the age of the knight. The man who rides on his horse, who is armored, who carries a lance, and uses cavalry tactics, he is virtually invincible.
Invincible in large part because of the leverage and balance his iron stirrups gave him in the saddle. A simple contest demonstrates the advantage. Two horsemen, one equipped with stirrups and one without, prepare to engage in a duel. The fighter in green uses his stirrups to generate force as he strikes. The horseman in brown has less leverage. His blows are weaker and he is easily thrown. Between the forged metal stirrup, the powerful horse, and the heavy armor, the mounted warrior cast an imposing shadow. The medieval heavy cavalrymen were battle systems unto themselves. They dominated European conflicts for 500 years. Tactically, these horse-borne warriors were often deployed like battering rams, bearing down on their enemies in a single line, sweeping men aside with the sheer force of their charge. Knights were the elite of the heavy cavalry. Their status and position were superior to that of regular soldiers. But knights had to buy their own armor and horses, so in effect, they became mercenaries for kings and dukes who paid them with gifts of land. The knights fought for their nobles at home and abroad. They had a distinct culture and a powerful influence on medieval conflict. By the middle of the 12th century, they were found across Western Europe. One of the knights' training methods, and also an exciting sport in medieval society, was the joust. Once again, it was the stirrup that provided the stability and balance.
He could carry bigger equipment. The lance suddenly went from a stick to almost a tree that he could carry, and this was knocking people out of the way.
Predictably, bigger weapons triggered better defense. By the 16th century, every warrior who could afford it was encased in heavy plate armor. Even the horses were protected. But plate metal is heavy, so just like the Assyrians with their chariots, knights sacrificed some mobility in favor of protection and momentum. Between the stirrup, the armor, and the lance, an approaching knight was difficult to deflect.
A rider can now put the lance under his arm and carry the impetus of the horse and the rider into a blow into an opponent.
Maximizing the potential of horse, rider, and weapons, the knight was the heavy fighting vehicle of the Middle Ages.
The man on his horse, a knight, is absolutely frightening. He was a mobile tank.
And an icon of cavalry armies that would persist for centuries as the apex of mobility in battle. Until the arrival of next great advance. 1914, World War I, Northwestern Europe. Two armies stagnated across a line of defensive trenches more than 500 miles long. Out of this massive deadlock, a revolutionary new weapon emerged, one that would change warfare forever. There in the trenches, with both sides trading fire and gaining little advantage, the need was obvious.
The question is, what kind of machine will enable you to break that trench stalemate?
The first solution came from Winston Churchill, Britain's first Lord of the Admiralty and a lover of new technology. Churchill had been captivated by armored cars, which combined mobility and protection.
Fast motor cars, and it was getting loads of publicity, all things Churchill lived for. So he backed the production of bigger and better armored cars.
The vehicles were successful against German cavalry in the early months of the war when the fighting was mobile. But they struggled in the mud and craters of the Western Front. Something with more traction was needed.
Trench stalemate brings about one of those light bulb moments in history.
The light bulb? A piece of American farm equipment that used tracks instead of wheels. What worked on the farm could work on the front. So Britain applied the concept to the world's first tank, Little Willie. The earliest prototype was a primitive metal box riding on imported American tracks. The British hoped the tracks would keep Little Willie from getting bogged down in the mud. But early tests were disappointing. Little Willie's nose stuck out in front, so if it fell into a trench, it couldn't climb out. The tank went back to the drawing board. And so, Big Willie was created, with a revolutionary new design. Its tracks went beyond the front of the body and were high enough to grip and climb over most obstacles it encountered.
The secret of this design is the way the tracks wrap all the way around the body of the tank. The reason for this is that the tanks are expected to cross wide trenches, 9 feet wide in some places, and rough ground.
Big Willie proved it was up to the task. Its crushing power was clear, and it was quickly sent to the front. The British thought they had an answer to the German trenches. In September 1916, Britain's Revolutionary War machine was unleashed on an unsuspecting enemy.
You've got to imagine a type of machine that nobody had ever seen before. And I don't just mean the Germans, I mean most of the British soldiers on the Somme had never seen anything like this. And they start moving in the pre-dawn mist when you can hardly see your hand in front of your face. It appears to slither along the ground. It's quite bizarre the way it moves.
So far as the Germans were concerned, they called these machines the devil, and the cry soon went up along the trenches, "The devil is coming."
Nothing you shoot at them will stop them, and in your mind, it's you they're coming for.
But once the Germans got over their initial shock, they realized Big Willie's bark was worse than its bite. The men inside the tank were vulnerable to counterattack.
Well, I'm in, and there's nowhere to put my hands because I'm between the transmission and the engine, and all that's hot, and I'm already feeling claustrophobic. This is the engine, a mass of red-hot moving parts. You can imagine the heat that that generates, and every crew member is only 2 or 3 feet away from it. The only way to communicate was with one of these. Of course, the crew can't really see what is going on, and they can't really derive the comfort from looking at each other because all they see is an outline in the dark. Their face is covered by one of these chainmail masks, which is some protection against the metal splinters that flake off the side of the tank as soon as it's struck by explosive.
The most difficult thing you have to worry about is plunging artillery fire, because artillery fire can kill a World War I tank. It's only moving 3 miles an hour. It's a big target.
It was only when they started to open up derelict tanks and discovered only the feet and legs of burnt crew members remaining because the upper part of the torso had completely been incinerated by the furnace, did it dawn on these people that they were part of a new type of warfare that nobody had ever experienced before.
These slow-moving monsters were futuristic in design and shocking to see, but they were not the answer to the Allies' prayers. On the Somme, many got stuck in shell craters or were destroyed by artillery. Only a third even made it to the German lines. Big Willie was designed for one specific goal: to break through German trenches and lead the Allied soldiers forward. But in the end, its novel design was unable to stand up to the rigors of war. It was too slow, had mechanical problems, and was not used as effectively as it could have been. But the tank would eventually come into its own. 20 years later, in World War II, it would establish itself as a critical weapon of war. 1940, Northwestern Europe. Hitler's Panzer tank divisions sliced through Belgium and France. Overpowering Allied defenses, they reached the English Channel in 10 days. Despite the failures of Big Willie, Germany had recognized the tank's potential and built up an impressive tank army. Ironically, one of their sources of inspiration was a British officer.
Major J.F.C. Fuller, the British Army, is visionary when it comes to the use of the tank.
After World War I, Fuller had rejected the original concept of tanks leading infantry into battle. He foresaw tank units that could be used in numbers and at high speed. Fuller's vision was radical, and the enemy was paying attention.
Fuller, ironically, can't sell the idea in Britain. He can't sell the idea in America, but the Germans are reading him.
One German in particular, General Heinz Guderian, the father of German tank warfare. Guderian turned Fuller's ideas into reality: high-speed armored divisions able to win battles on their own. The Panzers were unleashed on Belgium and France with great success. The early models emphasized speed over armor and firepower. They were supported by aircraft and by infantry carriers and artillery that were also on tracks. Importantly, the vehicles could also receive and send messages.
There's one thing that you might not think about, but it's absolutely essential. It's the ability of one tank to communicate with another, so it's the radio.
In 1940, most Allied tanks had receivers that could only handle incoming signals. But Guderian's tanks were equipped with two-way radios, so commanders could coordinate their forces during battle. Throughout 1940, the German panzer units had great success outmaneuvering and outfighting heavier Allied armor. But then, on the Eastern Front in June 1941, the tables began to turn. The Soviets rolled out a new tank that put the Panzer to shame. The Soviet tank had its origins in the 1920s, on the other side of the world. One of its primary design elements came from American inventor J. Walter Christie. Christie was a one-time race driver with a passion for speed. He created a futuristic tank that could pierce enemy lines, soar over trenches, and cruise on tracks at over 42 miles per hour. The secret was in Christie's suspension, which was far less rigid than previous designs. They were made to crawl, his to fly. Christie invented a truly innovative system.
The secret of it, ever so simple, large diameter wheels, like these, and each wheel on a separate swinging arm pressing against a big spring.
The swing arms were shock absorbers, allowing the track to move up and down on rough terrain. Christie offered his tank to the Americans, but they had a different philosophy on tanks and rejected it. So the Mercurial Christie sought out other buyers and sold his suspension to the Russians. They used it to create the legendary T-34. This was the tank that would take on the German Panzers in 1941. A young Leningrad engineer, Mikhail Pushkin, was put in charge of the T-34 project in the Ukraine. Pushkin's inspired idea, which exemplified a more general Russian military philosophy, was to design a tank that was basic but reliable, a workhorse on the battlefield. To prove its dependability, he drove 2 prototypes more than 400 miles to Moscow for his Red Army superiors to inspect. The T-34 won their approval, but Pushkin's design made no concessions to crew comfort, and his vehicles proved hardier than he.
Pushkin drove this tank throughout the winter. The conditions were so bad and the distance so great that he developed pneumonia and subsequently died.
But his death did little to slow the T-34 down. It quickly went into full production, and on the Eastern Front, its pace and firepower overwhelmed the German panzers. The T-34s also had another critical design feature that gave them an advantage.
For the first time, it incorporated sloping armour so that incoming fire can ricochet off the armour.
Sloped armor was a groundbreaking concept. The shells ricochet instead of piercing, because the effective thickness of the armor gets greater as its slope increases. Earlier tanks were designed like boxes on tracks, making enemy shells more likely to penetrate. But sloped armor gives the tank superior defense. It's a simple but effective concept. When an incoming shell meets a perpendicular armor surface, it goes straight through and probably kills the crew. If the armor plate is angled at 30 degrees, the shell might bury itself in the armor, but it doesn't go through. But if a shell strikes armor plate angled at 60 degrees, it bounces off, leaving the tank and crew unharmed.
The T-34 is probably the finest example of the use of sloped armour. Here at the front, this very sharp nose. And they achieved this because everything that makes the tank go, and that's the engine, the gearbox, the steering mechanism, it's all at the back.
Sloped armor is now a permanent feature on most modern tanks. The nose of the Abrams M1A2 is almost horizontal when viewed from the front. A British Cromwell tank from World War II, on the other hand, has a far more vertical nose. The American Abrams protects its crew, but is hardly a defensive weapon. It can also overpower the enemy with its 120mm gun and thermal sight. In Operation Desert Storm, it was able to engage Iraqi tanks from outside the effective range of their weapons.
We like fighting from far. We can hit from far. No questions asked. They won't know they got hit till they got hit and they're on fire.
The Abrams can also fire with great accuracy at speed. That capability depends on a platform that remains stable at all times. The same specification required by the ancient Egyptians for their chariots. The technology needed for the weapon's stability was perfected late in the 20th century. Gun stabilizers use gyroscopes to keep the weapon locked on target, regardless of the tank's movement over the ground.
Any type of terrain you can fire on. Doesn't matter how the tank is sitting. The hull can be sitting a certain way, the bottom part of the tank can be sitting a certain way, but the gun is still going to be leveled out, ready to shoot.
The Abrams uses superior range to outgun opposing tanks. It's a deadly tactic. In World War II, it was also Germany's belated but effective response to the Soviet T-34. The Germans countered the T-34 with the Tiger, a heavy tank with a long, highly accurate gun. The Tiger had a bloody impact on the battlefield. British tank officer Peter Gudgeon witnessed its power firsthand. This is the actual Tiger that almost killed him in the Battle for Tunis in 1943. He and his men engaged a group of German tanks dug in at the top of a hill.
First we knew about it was when the leading tank on my right blew up in a massive explosion. The commander and his wireless operator were blown out of the top of the turret. The tank was ablaze, an inferno. Next thing I felt was a shot passing right down my tank, just missing my right leg. I felt the draft of it on my right leg. And it crashed through into the engine and set us on fire.
Gudgeon expected more shots, but he and his men got lucky. A shot from another British tank struck the Tiger in the turret, disabling it. The German crew bailed out and fled.
Hit it anywhere else than where it did, probably wouldn't have made any difference. One amazingly lucky hit.
It wasn't long before the sophisticated firepower of the Tiger came up against the powerful T-34. They met in one of the biggest tank battles of all time. The outcome was a referendum on military capacity and on technological philosophy. 1943, Kursk, Western Russia. Nearby, in the village of Prokhorovka, one of history's most ferocious tank confrontations began. 450 German and 800 Russian tanks amassed near the top of a hill.
You are face to face in this incredible encounter. It's almost like hand-to-hand combat with tanks.
Ahead would have been hundreds of German tanks. And every single crewman must have felt they were lining up on him personally.
You don't have time to think. You fire, you shoot, you ram.
The feeling of vulnerability is completely accentuated by this lack of vision. All I can see is the next slope ahead and very little else. They must have felt dreadfully vulnerable.
The losses are phenomenal. You have to imagine men bailing out of tanks that are on fire, and when you bail out, you're going to get shot.
The casualties on both sides were terrible.
It's the Holocaust on the tank battlefield, because the next day there are these hundreds of burning hulks.
Though the numbers are disputed, it's estimated that close to 500 tanks were destroyed that day. And that was just one engagement in the larger battle for Kursk, which ultimately involved more than 6,000 tanks. After 7 weeks of fierce fighting, the Soviets were finally able to stop the German offensive. The Soviets suffered far greater personnel and equipment losses than the Germans, but in the long run, they were better able to absorb them, in part because of their low-tech approach to tank engineering.
But if there's one thing that characterizes all these Russian tanks, it's the crude finish, and it's very noticeable here on the T-34's turret. You can see cast markings, weld markings. Now, if you compare the rough finish of this tank with the German Panther over there, the contrast is fantastic. It's as if those tanks were finished off in the Mercedes-Benz body shop. It's a beautifully made machine.
Though lighter and cheaper than the Tiger, the Panther was a typical example of complex German engineering. But such precision came at the expense of manufacturing capacity. Fewer than 1,400 Tigers and only 6,000 Panthers were ever finished. The Russians, on the other hand, could crank out T-34s. Mikhail Kushkin's simple, reliable design allowed them to mass-produce more than 57,000 and overcome the Germans with sheer force of numbers. As the war progressed and Germany was forced from offense to defense, the Army reassessed its need for fast tanks to conquer enemy territory. Now trying to defend the fatherland, they sacrificed speed for better protection. The result was the Tiger II, or King Tiger. With double the frontal armor of its predecessor, this was the heaviest tank used in World War II. It didn't prevent the German defeat, but it was another example of the mission-specific trade-offs between speed, armor, and firepower. With the changing requirements, shifting fronts, and huge armies, World War II drove rapid advances in tank design, and it saw commanders developing new tactics to take advantage of these powerful, mobile weapons. Guns got bigger, armor got thicker, and killing capacity grew. By the close of the war, J. Walter Christie's vision of an armored racing vehicle had evolved into an all-round fighting machine that commanded the battlefield. A machine that would be effective for decades, until tanks built for big set-piece battles found themselves up against a new, deadly, and far more flexible weapon. A weapon that prompted some to wonder whether the big battle tank, like the Chariot long before it, would become obsolete. In 1973, a surprise attack on Israel by Egypt and Syria ignited the Yom Kippur War. Israel's tank forces, which had previously seemed invincible, suffered devastating losses. For 40 years, the most potent anti-tank weapon on the battlefield had been another tank. But in this war, Egyptian soldiers had another effective option.
There was an introduction of something that changed the equation on the battlefield, and that was this light, portable anti-tank weapon.
The Israeli tanks were being attacked by missiles that could be carried in suitcases and by rocket-propelled grenades. Anti-tank explosives had been around since World War II, but the missiles were a major improvement. A portable guided delivery system with a deadly warhead. Known as shaped charges, the warheads were designed to cut through even the thickest tank armor.
This is a shaped charge. The top part here is filled with explosive. This is designed so that when the explosion travels down here, this copper actually turns to liquid and is concentrated on a point down here. And that allows the liquid metal to actually puncture straight through the target.
It will completely carve up the crew, or it will set off ammunition fires, which in turn, of course, will produce internal explosions, which will completely finish them.
But of course, as soon as engineers realized what they were up against, they began searching for the next protective counterpunch to defend against it. In 1969, German armor scientist Manfred Held made a surprising discovery while conducting research in the Middle East. Held was testing shaped charge warheads on the wrecks of battle-damaged tanks.
I was alone there. I was a project leader. I made my own pictures from every test.
Held detonated his shaped charges on the tank's turrets, fully expecting them to perforate the armor and destroy the tanks. But when he reviewed his footage, he noticed much bigger explosions than he had anticipated. Upon investigation, he discovered that the shaped charges had set off live ammunition still sitting in the turret. He realized that the secondary explosion had neutralized the effect of the shaped charges.
So the stronger reaction have reduced the penetration capability.
By accident, Held had discovered a new way to protect a tank: explosive reactive armor. Like many modern tanks, the Israeli Blazer features the new protection. Its most vulnerable points, the front arc and turret, are fitted with close to 40 reactive plates. If a plate is hit, it explodes, countering the shaped charge and leaving the tank unharmed. A demonstration reveals how it works. Two towers of steel stand in for the armor of a tank. Each will take the brunt of a shaped charge attack. A charge is placed on top of each tower. There will be two explosions, one with explosive reactive protection and one without. The one with gets a sheet of plastic explosive placed at an angle between the shaped charge and the top steel block. This simulates the position of the plate on a tank.
When the shaped charge is fired, it will detonate the sheet of plastic explosive and hopefully disrupt the blast. Then we can compare the number of steel plates penetrated with the protection of explosive reactive armor and without. Firing in 3, 2, 1, firing! Firing! There was a huge release of energy in both those two explosions. This first stack, we didn't have anything between the shaped charge and the top plate.
The shaped charge left a neat entry hole, and the blast penetrated almost 6 plates. That's 6 inches of steel.
It's actually gone almost all the way through it. If we compare that to the stack that was protected by our simulated explosive reactive armor, the entry on the top plate is a lot messier. A lot of this seems to have been disrupted.
But the shaped charge has only gone through 3.5 plates. The explosive reactive armor has reduced the impact by almost half.
So had this been an attack on a tank, I think the protection offered by the explosive reactive armor could well have saved the crew's lives.
Once again, armor had caught up with the innovative weapons, intent on destroying it. Israel was the first to adopt the explosive reactive armor. It is just one of many safety features designed into Israel's main battle tank, the Merkava. After losing 2,500 men, most of them tank soldiers in the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis placed a high premium on tank crew protection. For such a small country with so few soldiers, the loss of highly skilled tank crews is a political, economic, and military tragedy. Soldiers are extremely precious, so their safety is the #1 priority. Firepower and mobility come second and third. Unlike all other main battle tanks, the Merkava's engine is in front, which puts an extra barrier between the crew and incoming fire. The tank's shape, streamlined and flat, makes it difficult to hit. Even the turret is designed to present a low-profile target.
The turret is basically on the top. It's very narrow, so it will be very, very hard to hit. As you can see, it's shaped as an arrow to the front.
If the tank is hit, soldiers have an increased chance of survival because ammunition and flammable liquids are kept separate from the crew area. and the crew can make a rapid exit through a rear-facing escape hatch.
What happens, I give my crew just a command. They all get out of their cells and just come out of the tank from this rear hatch. We can open it from inside. It just opens on the top and on the bottom. The whole crew gets out and we go to a safer spot.
The Israeli Merkava represents the pinnacle of crew safety, a conscious decision by the Israeli army to put protection first. But it is not necessarily the best all-round tank. Other countries, like the US, opt for a different balance of firepower, speed, and protection. The American Abrams has that balance. Early versions of the tank played a critical role in ground war offensives during both Gulf Wars. The latest Abrams, the M1A2, is even more intimidating, with improved armaments, protection, and electronics. Its massive 120-millimeter gun has a laser rangefinder, and it's tough, protected by multiple layers of steel and ceramics and an option of reactive armor.
Abrams tank is the most powerful battle tank in the world right now. There is no tank that can match an Abrams in open battle.
At close to 70 tons, the Abrams is one of the largest tanks ever to do battle. Inevitably, such size comes with consequences. It guzzles fuel at nearly 2 gallons per mile and is heavy to transport. But on open battlefields, its ability to project power far outweighs these kinds of logistical problems.
If you're projecting the possibility of a war with, say, an enemy like North Korea, that will be a conventional war. And you'll need an Abrams. You've got to have an Abrams.
But the Abrams isn't ideal for all conflicts, particularly the asymmetric battles of today, which are often fought in urban environments and against highly mobile insurgents.
Definitely the place that is the most dangerous for using a tank would be an urban environment. The most restrictions, the most opportunity to get behind you or over you to attack you.
Because of these limitations, weapons designers have had to produce less powerful but more flexible machines. The Stryker, used in Iraq since 2003, is an armored personnel carrier with 8 wheels instead of tracks. It's used as a battlefield taxi, delivering troops with speed and some protection. The Stryker's firepower and armor are inferior to that of the Abrams, and in Iraq it proved vulnerable to roadside bombs. But it is 3 times lighter than a battle tank, so it can easily be airlifted to trouble spots. And in urban environments, it is far more mobile.
A Stryker can go down streets that an Abrams tank is too large to get through, because the tank is so big and so powerful.
The Stryker is the latest in a tradition of lighter vehicles that have evolved alongside tanks in response to battlefield demands. Most recognizable is the Jeep, America's transport backbone during World War II. More recently, the Humvee has entered the battlefield as a hybrid troop carrier, ambulance, and automatic weapons platform. Equipped with a roof-mounted .50 caliber machine gun, it has found an important role in modern combat. Strykers and Humvees use their superior mobility to evade enemy guns. But because those guns are always becoming more potent, the most effective way to avoid being hit is to avoid being detected in the first place.
New rule of warfare is, if you can see it, you can hit it. If you can hit it, you can kill it. Doesn't matter what it is. So that makes the importance of not being seen much greater than it ever has been in the past.
And so designers of future weapons are investigating a new dimension of tank design: invisibility. Cutting-edge technologies from camouflage to stealth are being researched and tested. These Leopard 2 tanks from the Armored Battalion of the Danish Army are on their way to Helmand Province in Afghanistan. But before they leave, they are given a new skin to hide their presence from the enemy. Anti-tank weapons use thermal targeting to zero in on a tank's telltale heat signature. This camouflage helps disguise it. The skin combines layers of high-tech materials that deflect enemy radar and reduce the tank's thermal footprint. It's far from perfect, but the difference is easy to see. The front tank, without the new camouflage, shows up white-hot on the thermal imager. The second tank, which does have the new skin, is more difficult to see.
Most of the tank will not be visible on a thermal imager, so you will be able to get up and get the first shot before they even recognize you.
Though still in its infancy, some variation of camouflage technology may be the next step forward that gives its user an advantage on the battlefield. A battlefield that is always changing, where tanks must adapt to survive. Since before the Pharaohs, the wheels of war have turned beneath the most destructive fighting machines the world has ever seen. And thanks to technology's dynamic advance, the mobile forces of the world's armies have evolved to strike out at high speed and with great force. Over thousands of years, these machines have helped drive the changing tactics of battle, both protecting and killing with ever greater efficiency. The future will be no different, shaped by the awesome combination of speed, armor, and firepower.